I want you to picture a scene. A friend of mine visiting from the Middle East was recently just baffled by it. She was in a brightly lit Tokyo convenience store late at night, one of those places that's usually the picture of quiet efficiency. And suddenly, the atmosphere just shatters. A man stumbles in, clearly intoxicated, and just starts screaming at the young clerk and the manager. The aggression was, it was visceral, loud, nasty, physically intimidating.
Right.
But the thing that truly stunned my friend wasn't the man's rage. It was how the staff reacted. Because in so many other parts of the world, security would be called, the guy would be thrown out immediately. But here, they didn't fight back. They didn't argue. Instead, they bowed.
They apologized.
Repeatedly and deeply to a man who was, objectively, belligerently in the wrong. And watching that, you just have to ask, what drives this bizarre dynamic? Why does the abuser feel so entitled, and why do the victims feel so obligated to accept it? It turns out that drunk men's explosion wasn't just about the alcohol. It was a crack in the facade of a society where the rule, the customer is God, has twisted into something much, much darker. A system where people who spend their lives repressed finally find the one place they're allowed to dominate.
That scene you just described, while jarring to an outsider, is unfortunately the perfect illustration of what the Japanese media and experts have now specifically named Kasuhara.
Kasuhara. We've seen a lot of these Japanese compound words enter the global lexicon, but this one, it sounds uniquely grim. It's describing a form of psychological violence.
It is grim, and it's a widely recognized term now. Kasuhara is shorthand for customer harassment. It's often used with an oldie term, akushitsu kuri mu, which, well, it literally means malicious claims.
Malicious claims.
Right, or unreasonable demands. But the key difference here in the modern dynamic is the immediate escalation. It's not just an annoying request, it's a weaponized complaint.
Okay, so walk us through that pattern. If I complain my suit is cold, in a normal scenario, the staff, they reheat it or they comp the meal.
Right, but in a Kasuhara scenario, the customer might start with the cold soup, but when the staff tries to offer a solution, the customer rejects it immediately and intentionally escalates.
So they're not looking for a solution.
No. They bypass any attempt at resolution and jump straight into loud, nasty, often personal, verbal, or even physical abuse. The initial complaint is just the pretext. The real goal is dominance.
So the staff member says, "I'm sorry, here's a free drink," and the harasser just bats it away and demands to see the manager or starts questioning the employee's intelligence. It's about seizing an opportunity for psychological superiority.
Precisely. And this isn't just a few volatile individuals. This is a widespread social menace that's forcing the entire service sector, which, by the way, is about 70% of Japan's workforce, to fundamentally reassess its relationship with the customer.
70%.
We're talking about something that affects the daily working life of millions of people.
The image of Japanese politeness is so pervasive globally, you'd think these incidents would be rare exceptions. But we have data that establishes just how widespread this has become. What do the numbers actually say?
The data tells a radically different story. The labor union UA Zensen, they did a comprehensive survey, and the findings were just staggering in terms of volume.
Okay.
They found employees reported over 14,000 specific incidents of verbal harassment. On top of that, they tracked another 12,000 incidents involving outright threats or physical intimidation.
So that's what, over 26,000 specific reported incidents in just those two categories? It's almost impossible to graph the daily psychological grind that implies.
And you have to assume that's an undercount, right? Many things go unreported. But more disturbingly, when you look at the frequency, 70%. 7 out of every 10 employees surveyed reported receiving some form of abuse.
7 out of 10.
This isn't just occasional rudeness. It's a chronic professional risk. We see reports of people being told they are worthless or that they should drop dead.
That intensity of language, it makes it so clear this is way beyond dissatisfaction with a product. It's personal, targeted malice. To really grasp this, I think we need to get into some of the extreme examples that have been reported.
Yeah, these examples really illustrate a profound cultural collapse of boundaries.
Right.
One incident that's just unforgettable. It involved a customer at a restaurant. He was unhappy with how his crab was prepared.
Okay.
So instead of talking to the staff, he picked up the fried crab and physically smacked the employee's face with it.
With the crab, he used food as a weapon. That just demonstrates a staggering sense of entitlement.
Absolutely. And then there's another common category that involves outright fraud. paired with verbal abuse, exploiting that culture of deference just to get something for free.
Right.
So customers will fully finish a bowl of soup, an entire meal, consume a whole product, and then demand a full refund, claiming they were dissatisfied. And the staff, they're trained to prioritize the customer satisfaction above all else, so they're just forced to concede.
Even when the exploitation is completely obvious, and sometimes the humiliation seems to be the whole point, right? Almost like it's for public shaming or for the internet.
That's the modern evolution of the abuse, yeah. There's a highly publicized case of a restaurant customer who physically flung a tray at an employee. But it didn't stop there. When the employee instinctively responded by bowing deeply in apology, following that ingrained social script, the customer seized the moment. They took a picture of the bowing, humiliated worker and immediately uploaded it to the internet.
So they're weaponizing the very tradition of omotenashi against the employee. That's turning an act of forced humility into more digital aggression.
And the demands themselves can be completely audacious. There was this case of a businessman who booked the absolute lowest class of room at a mid-range hotel. He was so dissatisfied that he spent an hour verbally abusing the staff.
Over the cheapest room.
And he didn't just want a better room. He ordered the staff to find him a room at an entirely different luxury hotel nearby, and then insisted that the original hotel cover the cost of both the new luxury room and his taxi fare to get there.
So the complaint is trivial, the response is abuse, and the demand is wildly disproportionate. That mismatch seems to be the defining characteristic.
It is the core definition of the maliciousness here. The demand is not proportional to the complaint, which is a key component of how customer harassment is now being defined in law.
And while these incidents can sound almost unbelievable, the consequences are devastatingly real. We have to acknowledge that this has led to the gravest possible outcome.
That's the tragic reality that really forced this conversation into a crisis. In 2018, there was the heartbreaking suicide of a 26-year-old employee of the famous pork bun chain 551 Harai in Osaka. He took his own life after being subjected to relentless harassment, with customers telling him he was useless and that he should die. His family is now seeking damages, which is a very significant move in Japan, and it just emphasizes the lethal toll this abuse takes. This isn't just bad manners. This is a public health and workplace safety crisis.
The scale and the consequences are undeniable. But this brings us back to that central paradox. Why here? Why in a society so focused on courtesy and harmony does this entitlement flourish? It takes us right into the dark side of omotenashi.
That is truly the crux of this deep dive. The issue is so deeply embedded in the cultural ethos, really captured by the phrase, "Okeku-sama wa kami-sama."
The customer is God.
Right. And historically, that phrase was meant to encourage service workers to approach their craft with seriousness, with humility. It was about pride in your work, not subjugation.
So a focus on excellence, rooted in professional dignity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But over time, especially as Japan's economy boomed and service expectations went through the roof, the meaning just shifted dramatically. It stopped being about the employee's pride and became a tool for the customer's entitlement. When you take it to extremes, it creates this intensely hierarchical relationship where the customer is functionally infallible.
It sets up an expectation that the customer's pleasure is the absolute highest virtue, no matter how they behave.
And sociological analysis points out that this kind of, this over-the-top, deeply deferential service, while nice for the consumer, creates these totally unrealistic expectations. It normalizes being served instantly and perfectly. So when that happens, some individuals feel encouraged to take advantage, making increasingly selfish demands because they genuinely believe their satisfaction supersedes everything else, including the dignity of the person serving them.
So if that's the cultural infrastructure, the expectation of godhood, what provides the fuel? What's driving the individual, the businessman in the taxi, or the drunk in the convenience store, to become the abuser? The source material seems to point strongly to stress.
That is the consensus among experts, and it really speaks to a deep societal illness. When customer service employees themselves were surveyed about the root cause, about a quarter of them said the abuse is simply an easy outlet for stress.
An easy outlet, a guaranteed socially acceptable punching bag for pent-up frustration.
That is the dynamic at play. You have this endemic culture of long working hours, immense social pressure, and this deeply ingrained emotional suppression. The idea you must not complain or show weakness.
Right.
So people are just exhausted and frazzled. And because service staff are culturally expected to cater to every whim and maintain harmony, or wa, they become these accessible targets. And you see it escalate specifically around the year end when all that collective stress just peaks.
But I wonder, Does focusing on stress risk excusing the behavior? Or is it just explaining the context where the abuse thrives?
It's definitely about explaining the context. We're not excusing the actions, but trying to understand this trauma cycle. The culture of emotional suppression means people are constantly accumulating this psychological debt.
Yeah.
And that debt has to be paid somewhere.
And the hierarchical nature of omotenashi makes the service worker the designated bill collector.
Exactly. We can see the effects of this in these small, poignant stories that they really shine a light on this tragic cycle of abuse, this phenomenon of power externalization.
You're talking about the account of Mr. Tanaka, the veteran taxi driver. That story perfectly captures how quickly the power dynamics can flip.
It does. This came from a forum for taxi drivers sharing these experiences. So Mr. Tanaka picks up a middle-aged corporate executive late on a Friday night. The passenger is reeking of alcohol, which is, a common coping mechanism.
Sure.
And because of some unexpected road construction, Mr. Tanaka has to take a slight, totally standard detour.
A minor inconvenience, which becomes the catalyst.
The passenger just exploded. He didn't just complain. He started a sustained verbal attack on Mr. Tanaka's character, calling him useless societal trash, questioning his competence, his intelligence. He demanded Mr. Tanaka apologize not just for the route, but for wasting a VIP's time.
And you can just imagine that executive probably spent his entire day bowing to his own superiors, suppressing his own ego.
Exactly. And now, in the enclosed private space of the taxi, he can reverse that hierarchy instantly and safely. All that suppressed anger has a release point. He becomes the god, and the driver becomes the outlet.
And Mr. Tanaka?
He just gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white, and accepted the abuse in silence until the ride ended. It's a heartbreaking example of the executive exporting his trauma onto someone lower on the ladder.
It really reinforces the idea that emotional repression in corporate life finds this dedicated, mandated outlet in the service sector. And the culture even provides specific mechanisms for this release.
Yes, the source material notes these cultural phenomena. Using alcohol and cigarettes to get to so-called honest conversation in a repressed society. You have no communication, drinking communication, and tobacco communication.
So how does no communication function as that pressure release valve?
Well, in a typical Japanese corporate setting, direct criticism or, emotional expression is strictly moderated by hierarchy and the need for harmony.
Right.
No communication provides a sanctioned escape hatch.
Yeah.
By drinking together, the veneer of sobriety and formality is temporarily lifted. Superiors and subordinates can speak with what's seen as honest intimacy. But this forced honesty, fueled by alcohol and stress, can easily flip into aggression.
And when that aggression is directed outside the corporate peer group at a waiter, a taxi driver, it becomes Kasuhara.
Exactly. The service staff are the secondary victims of this enforced intimacy and released tension.
It's a system where people who are expected to endure constant stress in their own lives then use service staff to disperse that frustration without fear of reprisal. And if you look at the demographics of the perpetrators, it really supports this idea of frustrated powerlessness.
It does. Polls show the majority of perpetrators are men in their 40s or older. This is the demographic that was historically the backbone of the corporate system, the C-chain, the permanent employees.
But that promise of lifetime employment has really eroded since the 90s.
Precisely. These men are often grappling with the shock of a post-bubble reality, stagnant wages, limited mobility. They feel powerless within the very system they were promised they would inherit.
And so asserting authority over a service worker becomes a temporary way to disperse that feeling, to reclaim a shred of dignity.
They're exploiting the structural guarantee that the person serving them cannot fight back. Experts confirm that perpetrators are imbued with a superiority complex and explicitly look down on people who serve them. The abuse is a mechanism to reaffirm their superiority, even if it's just relative to a cashier.
And the psychological cost of this structural failure is borne almost entirely by the employees, leading to a public health crisis.
The emotional cost is profound. We're talking psychological trauma, anxiety, severe depression. And what often makes it worse is the institutional failure. Victims report feeling stress, not just from the abuse, but from the fact that companies frequently lack support systems. They're forced to shoulder the burden themselves.
So it's about the long-term cumulative toll of living under this customer is God, ethos. It's an unsustainable demand on a person's mental health.
The experiences of the victims show just how dehumanizing it can be. We really need to look at the reality for the staff on the front lines, constantly required to perform perfect deference.
Let's go back to the convenience store environment. The constant performance, that forced smile, it sounds exhausting.
It is. A young man named Hiroto, working the graveyard shift in Shinjuku, he captured this perfectly. He talked about the mandatory convenience store smile, a facial expression that he said feels less like a genuine gesture and more like a piece of plastic physically glued to his skin.
Wow. A plastic smile glued to the skin. That perfectly captures the forced theatrical performance of it all.
And he recounts one night, a visibly intoxicated businessman stumbles in. He drops a hot coffee on the floor, splashes it on Hiroto's shoes. Instead of being remorseful, the man starts screaming that the cup was defective and Hiroto was incompetent.
But the man had clearly just crushed the cup himself.
Exactly. But under the strict cultural code, Hiroto couldn't explain that. He couldn't show anger. He couldn't even look annoyed. He immediately dropped to his knees to wipe the floor, apologizing profusely, saying, "Mushiwe gozaimasen, I'm terribly sorry," over and over.
And the customer
Left without a word of thanks. And it was in that moment, kneeling on the floor, that Hiroto said he realized that to be the perfect employee, he had to cease being a human being. This self-erasure creates a deep psychological fracture.
And while Kasuhara affects all service workers, the evidence suggests it intersects sharply with existing prejudices, particularly against foreign workers. The convenience store job is even described as a bug lamp that attracts trouble.
And the rudeness they face is often amplified by xenophobic assumptions. Non-Japanese staff, who might still be mastering the nuances of polite Japanese, are easy targets because they're seen as less likely to have managerial support.
There's that powerful example involving an international student and just asking about a croquette.
Yes. The student recounted an experience with a regular customer who just seemed intent on finding fault. The student politely asked if the customer wanted his croquette heated, a standard question. "Croquette tatame disaramasu ka?"
A completely normal, innocuous question.
The customer immediately used it as a pretext for insult. He asked if the student was an international student, and when they said yes, he launched into an attack, saying, "Why is Japan accepting brainless people? Can you really study?" He was using this tiny moment to question the student's intelligence and their right to be in Japan.
Which is just disingenuous. The student noted that lots of customers do ask for croquettes to be microwaved.
Of course. The question wasn't about the temperature. It was about establishing a hierarchy. There's this widely observed sentiment that it's, quote, more socially acceptable to harass or bully people who are perceived to be in lower positions, making foreigners exceptionally easy targets.
And the abuse got so bad that one day the student finally tried to set a boundary.
Yes, when the same customer was yelling, the student said they would call the police. The customer dared them to.
And the devastating result of that attempt to draw a line.
The student was fired the next day. The reason given was a customer complaint about their attitude. And that just reinforces this devastating corporate message. Maintaining customer satisfaction is the priority, even at the cost of your dignity. If you push back, you lose your job.
This psychological toll and institutional failure, it leads directly to a massive long-term economic threat, especially with Japan's demographic challenges.
Absolutely. Japan is facing a severe chronic labor shortage, especially in the service sector. So companies have to prioritize worker welfare just to retain staff. If these conditions don't dramatically improve, people will just keep quitting.
And that creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? A vicious cycle.
A vicious circle of more harassment and more people quitting, which leads to a decline in service standards, fewer staff, longer waits, all of which, ironically, generates more legitimate customer dissatisfaction, which then fuels more Kasuhara.
So if the culture is the problem and the economy is being threatened, the only solution is to fundamentally change the legal and corporate landscape. And it seems we're finally seeing a definitive paradigm shift where Japan is officially saying the customer is not always right.
This is a huge, necessary movement. The recognition has shifted from anecdotal reports to concrete policy. The National Labor Ministry issued comprehensive guidelines back in 2022. And more critically, in 2023, they revised standards to recognize trauma from Kasuhara as a compensable workplace accident.
Classifying psychological trauma as a workplace accident, that's a massive step. It immediately imposes a legally enforceable duty of protection on firms, right?
Precisely. Companies can't just brush this off anymore. They now have an explicit obligation, a duty of safety consideration at work, to actively mitigate this risk. And this all culminated in the most significant piece of local legislation yet, the Tokyo Ordinance.
The Tokyo Customer Harassment Prevention Ordinance, passed in October 2024, effective April 2025. This is the first of its kind. What's its core function?
Its core function is to establish an effort obligation for all businesses in Tokyo to proactively prevent customer harassment. It mandates that companies must take measures, and it clearly states for the first time that no one shall engage in customer harassment. The real value here is that it moves the definition of harassment from a vague concept to a clear, official legal standard.
And it's organized into 3 sophisticated categories of prohibited behavior.
Exactly.
Okay, let's break those down, because that's where the legal standard really takes shape.
So the first category is the most straightforward. Requests that lack validity. This means the request itself is just unreasonable or baseless. Demanding a full refund for a product you bought 5 years ago, for example, the demand itself is the offense.
Okay, that's targeting the malicious claim part. What about the second category?
The second category focuses purely on the means and manner used to get what you want. Regardless of whether the request itself is valid, this prohibits actions that are illegal or socially unjustifiable.
Give us a clear illustration of that.
Well, physical violence, obviously.
Yeah.
But also sustained, vicious verbal abuse for hours, or forcing a worker to kneel down on the ground to apologize. Those means are prohibited because they violate the employee's dignity, even if the underlying complaint might have been legitimate.
So using violence or public humiliation is illegal, period. And the third category is the most nuanced, dealing with proportionality.
It is. The third category deals with situations where the means are socially unacceptable in light of the appropriateness of the content. So let's imagine a scenario. A customer finds a minor defect in a $10 meal.
Okay.
The staff immediately offers a full refund and a new meal, a valid solution. But the customer insists on a 2-hour verbal tirade, demanding $1,000 in compensation and threatening to ruin the restaurant online.
So in that scenario, the $1,000 demand and the 2-hour tirade are the unacceptable means because they're wildly disproportionate to the minor defect in a cheap meal.
Exactly. The level of aggression and the demand for compensation just far exceed any reasonable response. And the third category is crucial because it gives businesses the legal footing to refuse to engage with abusive behavior.
What's also fascinating about the Tokyo Ordinance is its broad scope. Where does the protection actually extend?
It extends to anyone with a reasonable connection to a Tokyo-based business. This is vital because it includes employees residing outside of Tokyo who telework for a Tokyo company, and critically, call center employees located far away who are responding to inquiries for a Tokyo business.
That ensures protection for some of the most vulnerable staff. And now let's address the elephant in the room. Does it carry specific criminal penalties?
Currently, no. It's focused on raising awareness and setting clear expectations. But, and this is a big but, this lack of direct penalties doesn't mean businesses can ignore it.
Right.
The ordinance significantly increases a business's liability risk for violating that duty to give due consideration to safety. If a business fails to implement the required measures, they become much more exposed in any legal case brought by an employee.
So if the law mandates this effort obligation, what specific measures are businesses actually required to implement now?
They fall into 3 key areas. First, proactive preparation. Companies must create and externally disseminate a zero-tolerance policy. That means posting clear signs, drawing a firm boundary before an interaction even begins.
Basically telling the customer, your entitlement stops here. What about supporting the employee after an incident?
That's the second area, support systems. Businesses must establish confidential consultation services for employees, and crucially, companies are required to prohibit any retaliatory treatment for employees who use these services. They need to feel safe coming forward.
Unlike the foreign student we talked about. And finally, managing the aftermath.
Right. On-site response and recurrence prevention. This includes developing clear procedures for what to do during an incident and ensuring robust post-incident care for the mental and physical health of the employee. That means immediate stress checks and, if necessary, professional medical referrals. The whole framework shifts the burden from the individual employee to the company itself.
Beyond policy, major corporations are also adopting specific technological and practical measures to create a buffer for their staff.
We've seen major convenience store chains like Lawson and Family Mart giving employees the option to conceal or remove their full names from badges.
That's a direct response to the threat of doxing and online shaming.
Exactly. It minimizes the personal exposure of the employee.
Yep.
And some of the tech being developed.
Yeah.
It sounds like science fiction.
Right.
SoftBank is developing an AI-based voice-altering software specifically designed to tune out the anger in customer calls. The tech essentially filters the acoustic properties of shouting, making an angry person sound calm on the phone. It's an emotional firewall.
That sounds incredibly innovative. But I have to wonder, are we just treating the symptom? Doesn't filtering the anger risk enabling the abuse by ensuring the perpetrator never faces the consequences?
That is the crucial ethical question being debated. On one hand, the primary mandate is employee protection. If it reduces trauma, it's beneficial. On the other, by reducing that negative feedback, it might condition the abuser to continue, knowing there are no repercussions.
It's a trade-off. Immediate safety versus long-term cultural change. I also saw that AI is being used for training, which seems more proactive.
Yes. Experts are collaborating with firms like Fujitsu to build AI-driven training tools. They simulate high-stress abusive scenarios and coach employee responses. And fascinatingly, the AI is designed to diagnose each individual's personal threshold for harassment, allowing companies to personalize training and not push workers past their breaking point.
This shift is revolutionary, but ultimately the core problem is cultural. The extreme deference. We really need to look outside Japan to understand why clear boundaries matter so much.
The comparative analysis here is extremely instructive. We have a powerful anecdote that perfectly contrasts the traditional Japanese approach with Western Europe.
This is the experience of Yumi, who worked as a barista abroad.
Yumi spent 3 years working in a popular cafe in Paris. She described an incident where a customer snapped his fingers at her and insisted on being served immediately. Her French manager stepped in, told the customer he was being insulting, and said, "My staff are not your servants. Please leave."
Wow.
The manager prioritized Yumi's dignity over the customer's payment. She said she felt protected, valued, and fundamentally human.
That's a clear, non-negotiable line being drawn. So contrast that with her experience back in Tokyo.
Her first month back, she's at a high-end cafe. A customer starts berating a junior staff member because the ice in his water had melted too quickly. A truly trivial complaint.
Right.
The manager, instead of intervening, forced the young colleague to write a formal physical apology note and gave the harasser a free meal coupon.
So the ultimate preservation of customer satisfaction, even at the cost of the employee's dignity. The manager basically taught the abuser that his behavior was profitable.
Yumi called it a profound reverse culture shock. In European contexts, policies explicitly tackle third-party violence. They set a non-negotiable line where employee rights begin. In the traditional Japanese context, preserving whole harmony and customer satisfaction often superseded individual protection.
So while the Japanese spirit of service is lauded, the lack of clear boundaries created the structural space where abuse could just flourish.
And this taps into deep psychological differences in how self-regard is maintained, which explains why Japanese employees find it so much harder to push back. In North American culture, you have the independent self. Your self-regard comes from individual success, from being unique.
Your self-worth is separate from the group.
Exactly. But in Japanese culture, there's often an emphasis on the interdependent self. Here, self-regard is maintained largely by belonging to a group, fulfilling your role, and critically avoiding criticism.
And if an employee pushes back against a customer, they risk disrupting the harmony, the law of the business, and inviting criticism from management, which is fundamentally damaging to that interdependent self.
That's the psychological trap. For Japanese employee, deference and gambaru, that cultural value of dogged perseverance, are deeply tied to maintaining their status and group acceptance. Pushing back against abuse feels like a personal failure because it risks group harmony. It is psychologically harder to do. In synthesis, Kasuhara is the result of a high-pressure repressed society that has, for decades, exported its internal stress onto those in culturally vulnerable service positions, ruthlessly exploiting the customer is God ethos, and highlighting the immense hidden cost of those high service expectations.
This cultural evolution is a profound structural reckoning. The customer as God mentality created this dangerous vertical power dynamic that was mercilessly exploited by individuals seeking an outlet for their own repression. The growing legal and corporate movement in Japan to define and prohibit Kasuhara, culminating in clear legal definitions and AI-backed protections, is a necessary and maybe overdue recognition that the collective psychological price of treating the customer as God is simply too high. It signifies a cultural evolution toward prioritizing worker dignity over absolute customer satisfaction, finally giving the convenience store clerk the legal and structural ability to say, "I am not your punching bag."